You're listening to the Beyond Disciplines podcast, produced by the Faculty of Arts and Science at Concordia University in Montreal. The Beyond Disciplines podcast is a conversation series that brings scholars together across different fields of knowledge. From job applications to morning radio to late night comedy TV, interviews are all around us. But what role does interviewing play in academic research? Join us today for a look at the art of the interview. We'll hear from 4 researchers at Concordia who are all using interviews as part of their methodology. Francine Pelletier, Krista Byers-Heinlein, Kregg Hetherington, Liz Miller, and Shannon Hebblethwaite.
Do you remember one great interview that sticks out in your mind where it kind of, for whatever reason?
I think the most interesting interviews for me are the kids with the most complicated language situations. So I've interviewed some parents where between, grandma and grandpa and mom and dad and all these people in their lives who speak different languages, the kid might be exposed to 5 or 6 different languages. Now, we don't know what the limit is for the number of languages that you can learn, but it's always interesting really learning about families' lives and how they work. One of the things we're just trying to understand, and it's very poorly understood, is even what's the normal path of development for someone who's growing up with 2 languages. It might not be exactly the same as a baby who's learning just 1 language. So you get parents sometimes who are worried that their baby is delayed, and even speech-language pathologists who don't know how to clinically evaluate a baby who's from a bilingual background to know, do they really have a language difficulty or language disorder, or is this just part of bilingual development? So sometimes we don't think about the fact that, babies can only learn things at a certain rate, for example. So, if a baby can learn, 10 words in a month, if you're learning 1 language, great, all your words will be in English, say, but if you're learning 2 languages, half your words will be in French and half your words will be in English. So, okay, that bilingual baby now has learned 5 English words compared to that monolingual baby who's learned 10 English words. So if you just looked at the English, you could say, oh my gosh, that bilingual baby is way behind, only knows half as much. Well, it's not actually true. The other half of their knowledge is in the other language, right? So they can't learn twice as fast. So it's really important for us to have perspective on what to expect at different ages, what's the normal path, so we can really, support these kids and know when they might have a speech and language problem or when it's just normal development that we'd expect.
So there's a kind of a class of interview that I always had trouble getting into, and I always was worried about going into them. I still am. They're still very difficult for me, which is when I talk to producers. And there's 2 reasons why.
That means farmers?
The farmers, yes. So they call themselves producers to differentiate themselves from farmers, who are the people who think that the producers are bad. And there's this whole thing about that. So the producers, or the sojeros, as in the soy producers, are, because I sort of started thinking of them as bad people. That was how I first encountered them. That it made it very difficult for me to figure out how I was going to encounter those. But also because in the age of Google, when I ask someone for an interview, they immediately look me up and they find out that I've published things about people with whom that they disagree, right? So I know going into any of these encounters, if someone grants me an interview, that we're already going in some ways on an antagonistic basis. And so the interviews that I love, that I come out of thinking that was a great interview, are the ones where they start like that and then some switch happens for whatever reason. And you find a way in which you don't necessarily agree on everything. In fact, you generally don't, but you learn to sort of respect each other in the moment, and you learn to have a really great conversation anyways. And so there have been a couple of those. There was one last year where I met someone over beer at a party that another producer had invited me to, and I was very, very nervous. And went to this place, and there are all these producers talking their producer talk and talking about how all the peasants that I hang out with are ignorant and terrible, and I'm having to hold my tongue. And one of these people I started just chatting with, and he ended up inviting me back to his place, and we spent 2 days together, most of it on tape. Just talking about his life story and he was just a really, really great person. I keep in touch with him now as well, even though we both understand that we have very different positions on the way he makes his living.
Well, for example, I was drawn to a story in Panama of an indigenous island that was actually doing a planned retreat. The stories I've heard a lot of are sinking islands, but I hadn't heard of like a community coming together. And one of the things that I tell my students in terms of like good documentary practice is you want to be with someone who's in the process of making a difficult decision. And so this particular island was in the process of a boom in tourism. And so the younger generation was like really happy about all the things that were happening in this sinking island, like all of this opportunities. And the older generation were really feeling like we have to be in control of this process and we want to move. So I wanted to be a part of this community making this difficult decision.
We've been asking them generally to tell us their story. So we've been doing narrative research, very broad questions. Tell us your story of becoming a mother and what that means to them, what their experience has been like. And we asked them specifically about the leisure that they engage in, whether that has changed for them. And so the one thing that's sort of, again, new and maybe artful about our interviewing technique is we ask them to bring these artifacts, and that's what this picture is that I'll try to explain for you a little bit. This was what one mother called a fairy godmother box. And so we asked them to come to the interview and share their experience of being a mom and what that meant to them, and to do that with some objects, things that were meaningful for them in their transition. So we saw a wide variety of things. But this, I think, is an interesting illustration of that. One mother shared her story of really resisting this sense of the commercialization of motherhood and this sense that you have to buy all this expensive stuff in order to be, quote unquote, a good mother. And she really didn't want any part of that discourse, and she told this story in her way of resisting that her friends and family threw her baby shower for her, and instead of giving her the expensive bamboo blankets that her baby was only going to barf on, which was her words, they gave her this fairy godmother box, and they all put something personal and special in there. And what this kind of highlighted for us, they brought things like poems that they loved or stories that they liked to share, or pieces of advice, those sorts of things, poems they had written themselves. And it was a chance for these primarily women, although she did talk about some fairy gunkles, not fairy godmothers, but fairy gunkles who were involved as well, that were able to kind of pass on their knowledge.
Thanks again for listening to the Beyond Disciplines podcast, supported by the Faculty of Arts and Science at Concordia. Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyagahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in the Montreal community. This episode was produced by Aaron Lakoff and Simone Lucas. Thank you to all our guests. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. When you're there, leave us a rating and a review. It helps other people find this podcast. Questions or comments? Email us at beyonddisciplines@gmail.com.